Horatio Nelson was born into the England of small parishes and widening seas, when the island's fields still seemed old as the Psalms, and its horizons were newly measured by charts, cannon, and trade. The year was 1758, and Britain was in the midst of the 7 Years' War, the first struggle that felt, even to contemporaries, like a world war. Empires were becoming commercial organisms, fed by shipping lanes and defended by fleets, and the ocean, once a boundary, had become the main road. In that transition, half rural, half maritime, Nelson's character was formed, a country clergyman's son with the manners of a Norfolk rectory, and the instincts of a man who would live, think, and finally die to make the sea an English moat. He first saw the world in Burnham Thorpe, a village in Norfolk, on September 29, 1758. His father, Edmund Nelson, was the rector, learned, conscientious, poor in the dignified way of the 18th-century Church of England. His mother, Catherine Suckling, brought gentler blood and a connection to political greatness. The Sucklings were related to the family of Sir Robert Walpole. The household was large. The arithmetic of many children and modest income teaches early thrift, self-command, and that subtle English stoicism which can be tenderness, disciplined by necessity. Nelson's mother died when he was still a boy, and the loss, so early, so irreversible, seems to have sharpened in him that peculiar hunger for attachment which later poured itself into friends, comrades, patrons, and finally an ill-fated passion. He would be, throughout his life, both fiercely independent in action and unusually dependent in feeling. He was not born for the sea in the robust, careless way of sailors' sons. He was slight, often ill, and easily made miserable by discomfort. But history has a fondness for such contradictions, the frail body that houses an iron will, the sensitive nerves that, once committed, refuse retreat. At 12, an age when most boys are still learning what kind of man they might be, he entered the Royal Navy with the help of his uncle, Captain Maurice Suckling. It was 1771. The Navy of that time was not merely a service, it was a school of empire, a harsh and comprehensive education conducted by weather, discipline, hunger, and sudden death. A ship was a floating hierarchy, and the ocean an impartial examiner. Nelson's early years were a curriculum in extremity. He sailed to the West Indies. He went north toward the Arctic in an expedition under Constantine Phipps, where, in the popular anecdote, he chased a polar bear with a musket, as if youthful bravado could domesticate the sublime. He served in the East Indies and learned what heat and disease can do to men. He suffered enough illness that his survival itself seemed sometimes a matter of stubbornness. Yet he advanced. At 19, he passed for lieutenant, no small achievement in an era when competence could be as decisive as patronage, but never entirely free of it. He had, along with courage, a talent for work. He studied seamanship, gunnery, the habits of wind and tide, the management of men. Most of all, he learned by daily contact that morale is a weapon and that a fleet is not only ships, but souls. During the American War of Independence, Nelson served in the Caribbean and Central America. There, amid heat, mosquitoes, and mismanaged expeditions, he learned a second lesson, that strategy is often ruined by logistics, and that official plans can dissolve when they meet real geography. In 1780, he took part in operations against Spanish possessions in Central America and paid for it with severe illness, malaria or dysentery, the old empire's tax on ambition. He returned to England thin and weakened, but with his appetite for command intact. The Navy, like the sea, has little pity. It rewards those who endure. In 1784 he became captain of HMS Boreas and was stationed in the West Indies. There the war had ended, and he found himself in the unglamorous work of enforcing the Navigation Acts, those mercantile regulations that tried to keep colonial trade obedient to British interests. It was duty without the music of battle, and it made him enemies among merchants and local elites who had grown accustomed to evasion. Nelson enforced the law with a Puritan firmness that already hinted at the later man. He could be flexible in tactics and inflexible in moral certainty, sometimes in the same hour. In Nevis, in 1787, he married Frances Fanny Nisbet, a young widow from a respectable colonial family. The marriage was conventional in origin and, for a time, affectionate. But Nelson was a man built for intensity. Domestic calm did not suit the rhythm of his inner life. Peace is often harder for the warlike than danger. For several years after 1787, he lived on half-pay, the Navy's polite name for enforced idleness. Britain was not at war, and captains without ships waited like hounds held back from the hunt. Nelson chafed, wrote letters, tended to his small fortunes and friendships, and, one suspects, rehearsed in his imagination the commands he was not yet given. Then the French Revolution ignited Europe, and war returned with the inevitability of tide. In 1793, Britain entered the conflict against revolutionary France. Nelson was given HMS Agamemnon, and his true career began in the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean was then the old stage of empires, Greek, Roman, Venetian, Spanish, now contested by Bourbon decline and revolutionary ambition. Britain's interest was strategic: to contain France, protect trade routes, and keep open the channels to India and the Levant. Nelson, serving under admirals who could be cautious and political, distinguished himself by a simple method. He went toward the enemy. At Toulon, where British forces briefly held a precarious position against French Republicans, he displayed energy and initiative. In operations around Corsica, he took part in the siege of Calvi in 1794 and suffered the injury that began his outward transformation into a living emblem. A shot or splinter damaged his right eye. He never lost it entirely, but his vision was impaired. In a world that admired physical wholeness, he began to acquire the marks of sacrifice, the visible receipts of danger. It is worth noticing how such wounds, in the economy of public feeling, become arguments. The nation sees the body of its champion altered and believes, with the naive justice of crowds, that such a man must be sincere. His ascent accelerated. In 1796 and 1797, the war broadened. Spain entered against Britain, and the seas became crowded with enemies. At the Battle of Cape St. Vincent on February 14, 1797, Nelson served under Sir John Jervis. The Spanish fleet was larger. The situation demanded discipline. Nelson supplied something else: audacity. He broke from the line, an act that could have been branded as reckless insubordination, cut into the enemy formation, and turned confusion into advantage. The story is famous for its theatrical climax. Nelson led boarding parties, captured one Spanish ship, and used it as a bridge to board and capture another, turning naval battle into hand-to-hand conquest. The Navy admired results, and Britain adored drama. He was knighted and promoted to Rear Admiral. That same year, he led an attack on Santa Cruz de Tenerife in the Canary Islands, and there fortune turned. The assault failed, and Nelson was hit grievously. His right arm was shattered and had to be amputated. He was 38 and already, in body, an old soldier. Yet the loss did not diminish him. It concentrated him. He learned to write and command with one hand, to signal, to point, to live in constant discomfort. Pain, for some men, is merely pain. For others, it becomes a forge. Nelson's letters after this show a man who could be exuberant and despairing, proud and needy, sometimes within a page, an emotional volatility disciplined only when action demanded clarity. The year 1798 gave him what he most desired: an independent command and a chance to strike at the grand strategy of France. Napoleon Bonaparte had sailed for Egypt, aiming to threaten British access to India and to carve an Eastern empire out of ancient lands. Nelson was sent to find and destroy the French fleet. It was a chase across a wide sea, complicated by imperfect intelligence, storms, and the maddening slowness of sailing ships dependent on fickle winds. Here, Nelson's persistence, bordering on obsession, became an advantage. He searched, guessed, doubled back, and searched again. The Mediterranean, that familiar basin, suddenly seemed enormous. On August 1st, 1798, at Aboukir Bay near the mouth of the Nile, he found the French fleet anchored in a line, confident that the shallow water on one side protected them. Nelson looked, judged, and attacked at once, without waiting for morning. It was a decision as psychological as it was tactical, to strike before the enemy's nerves could settle, to make darkness an ally. British ships slipped between the French line and the shore, an audacious move that the French had assumed impossible, and engaged from both sides. The battle raged through the night. Ships burned, magazines exploded, men died in heaps. By morning, the French naval force in the Mediterranean was shattered. Napoleon, ashore in Egypt, was strategically stranded. The Battle of the Nile made Nelson a European name. It was not merely a victory, it was a narrative. The lone commander, the relentless search, the sudden night attack, the annihilation of a great fleet. Britain celebrated him as if he were a remedy to all the anxieties of revolutionary war. He was raised to the peerage as Baron Nelson. But greatness, once public, demands a private cost. The nation wanted a hero without contradictions. Nelson was a man full of them. After the Nile, he entered Naples, and there his life took the turn that would permanently complicate his legend. The court of Naples, Ferdinand IV and Queen Maria Carolina, was terrified of French influence and revolutionary contagion. The British envoy, Sir William Hamilton, lived there with his wife Emma, a woman of extraordinary charm and intelligence, born into poverty and risen into the ambiguous dignity of being both admired and judged. Nelson met the Hamiltons in the aftermath of his triumph and fell into a relationship with Emma that became, over time, not a mere affair, but a public entanglement. In that society, where manners were both weapon and veil, the scandal was considerable. In Nelson's more severe English world, it became a moral blemish attached to a national icon. It was in Naples, too, that Nelson's judgment was tested in a way less flattering than at sea. The Neapolitan counter-revolution took revenge on Republicans and collaborators, and Nelson became involved, directly or indirectly, in harsh measures, including the fate of Francesco Caracciolo, a Neapolitan admiral executed after the Restoration. To Nelson's admirers, he was defending legitimate authority against revolutionary chaos. To critics, he lent the prestige of British victory to an ugly repression. The episode reveals what battle sometimes conceals, that moral clarity is easier in combat than in politics, and that the same certainty that produces decisive action can also produce cruelty when applied without restraint. Nelson's heart was tender, but his sense of loyalty, once engaged, could be implacable. He returned to England, lionized, and found himself both celebrated and observed. His marriage to Fanny, already strained by long separations and by Nelson's need for emotional intensity, did not survive the arrival of Emma as the center of his private life. He and Fanny separated. Emma became his companion openly, and in 1801 their daughter, Horatia, was born, acknowledged in a tangle of discretion and denial characteristic of an age that demanded propriety while thriving on gossip. Nelson's domestic life became a contradiction enacted in public, the champion of national duty living in a way many contemporaries considered a private dereliction. Yet war does not pause for moral bookkeeping. In 1801, Nelson was sent to the Baltic under Sir Hyde Parker to confront the League of Armed Neutrality, Denmark, Sweden, Russia, whose policies threatened Britain's ability to search neutral ships and maintain its blockade against France. The strategic background was cold and commercial, but the action became one of Nelson's most famous performances, the Battle of Copenhagen on April 2nd, 1801. The Danish defenses were formidable and the engagement bloody. At a critical moment, Parker, cautious and distant, signaled Nelson to break off the action. Nelson, who could be both obedient and insubordinate in the service of what he considered necessity, famously put his telescope to his blind eye and said he could not see the signal. He continued the attack and forced Denmark to negotiate. The episode entered British folklore as the triumph of boldness over timidity, but its deeper meaning lies in the nature of command. Nelson understood that in war, hesitation can be as fatal as error, and that a commander sometimes must accept personal responsibility for disobedience when he believes the larger purpose demands it. He was promoted, and for a time he stood at the apex of his profession. Peace, briefly, returned with the Treaty of Amiens in 1802. Nelson, restless in peace, tried to become a country gentleman at Merton Place, near London, in a domestic arrangement that was never quite domestic. He lived with Emma and Sir William Hamilton in a menage that society discussed with a mixture of amusement and disapproval. His health was poor, his wounds troubled him, his finances were strained by generosity and by the expenses of his household. He craved not only love but admiration, and the public, while adoring, is never a stable source of comfort. Nelson's letters from this period show a man trying to find quiet and failing, like a ship designed for the open sea, confined to a river. In 1803, war resumed, as it almost had to. Napoleon's France could not easily coexist with Britain's maritime supremacy. Each was the other's obstacle. Nelson was sent again to the Mediterranean to command the blockade of Toulon, where the French fleet lay under the protection of fortifications and the logic of caution. A blockade is the least glamorous form of naval warfare. Long months of watching, storms, disease, rationing, and the constant risk that the enemy will slip out in bad weather. It requires patience, organization, and an ability to keep men's spirits from rotting. Nelson proved as capable at this slow war as at sudden battle. He created among his captains what he called a band of brothers, a culture of mutual trust, shared understanding, and initiative. He did not micromanage. He communicated intent. He expected his captains to think, to act, to seize opportunities. In an age when rigid adherence to signals could produce paralysis, Nelson cultivated a fleet that could improvise while still obeying a common purpose. This, as much as any single tactical maneuver, was his genius. The campaign of 1805 tested that genius in the form of a chase worthy of the epics. The French fleet under Villeneuve escaped Toulon, joined with Spanish ships, and sailed into the Atlantic. Napoleon hoped to draw the British away, gain temporary control of the Channel, and cover an invasion of England. Nelson pursued Villeneuve across the ocean to the West Indies and back, missing him in one direction by days, then in the other by a margin equally cruel. It was war conducted on the scale of weather and weeks, where a wrong assumption could undo months of effort. When Villeneuve returned to Europe, and eventually took refuge at Cadiz, the invasion plan faltered, but Napoleon's war, like a machine, sought other uses for its parts. The combined Franco-Spanish fleet still threatened British control, and Nelson was called to finish the contest not as a strategist alone, but as an executioner of naval power. He arrived to take command of the blockading fleet off Cadiz in September 1805. By then he had become a national symbol, and he knew it. He also knew, with the clarity that sometimes comes to the exhausted, that he was near the end of his life. He wrote as if he were already arranging his own memorial, asking the nation to care for Emma and Horatio should he die, a request that reveals both his sense of destiny and the private anxiety beneath it. The state that adored his victories, would later prove less generous than his hope. On October 21st, 1805, Villeneuve sailed, and Nelson pursued. The Battle of Trafalgar occurred off the southwest coast of Spain, in waters that would become a kind of patriotic scripture for Britain. Nelson's plan was simple in conception and dangerous in execution. Instead of forming a parallel line to engage the enemy line ship for ship, he would attack in two columns, drive through the enemy formation, cut it into segments, and destroy it piecemeal. The approach meant that his leading ships would endure heavy fire as they advanced. It required disciplined seamanship, steady nerves, and the faith of captains in their commander. Nelson accepted the risk because he wanted not merely to defeat the enemy, but to annihilate the possibility that Napoleon could ever again challenge Britain at sea. Before the engagement, he sent the signal that has outlived the details of the battle. England expects that every man will do his duty. It was not a brilliant sentence. It was better. It was the exact kind of sentence a nation wishes to hear in a crisis, plain, moral, collective. It placed the burden of history not on the commander alone, but on every sailor. The battle unfolded with terrible intimacy. Nelson's flagship, HMS Victory, led one column. Collingwood's Royal Sovereign led the other. Cannon tore into hulls. Rigging fell like strangled vines. Decks became slaughterhouses. Nelson, conspicuous in his uniform and decorations, refused to hide. In an age that had not yet invented the modern cult of safety for leaders, he believed visibility was part of command. It was also vanity, perhaps, but vanity can be the shadow of courage. Around 1:30 in the afternoon, a musket ball fired from the French ship Redoutable struck him. It entered his shoulder and lodged near his spine. He was carried below, where he endured several hours of pain while the battle raged above. He asked repeatedly about the outcome. The victory came, decisive and complete. The combined fleet was shattered. Britain's command of the sea was secured for a generation. Nelson's last hours have been embroidered by memory, but the essential fact is firm. He died knowing he had achieved the purpose of his life. His reported final sentiment, often given as gratitude that he had done his duty, fits the man and the age. He died at 47, an age when many commanders are only ripening, but his life had been compressed by action into something that felt longer. His body was taken home, preserved during the voyage in spirits. The popular imagination, which prefers a vivid detail to a sober truth, later surrounded this with tales of sailors drinking the liquor and calling it Nelson's blood. Whether or not any such thing occurred in the literal sense, the metaphor was apt. His death became part of the Navy's mythology, the kind that sustains men in the next war. In January 1806, he received a state funeral at St. Paul's Cathedral. London turned grief into ceremony, and ceremony into a national lesson. The hero was made official. What, then, was Nelson? Not merely a brilliant tactician, though he was that. Not merely a fearless fighter, though he was that too. His distinctive gift lay in the marriage of audacity with human connection. He inspired his men not by cold authority, but by emotional force, by making them feel that they were seen, trusted, and part of a shared greatness. In an institution that could be brutal and impersonal, he offered a sense of fraternity without sacrificing discipline. He created, in the harsh grammar of war, a kind of loyalty that felt personal and therefore durable. When he spoke of his captains as brothers, it was not sentiment alone. It was method. He built a culture where initiative was safe because intent was clear. And yet he was not a plaster saint. His private life violated the moral expectations of many contemporaries. His conduct in Naples stained his reputation among those who believe that victory does not absolve injustice. Even his celebrated insubordination raises questions. In the hands of a lesser man, such disobedience could become mere recklessness. Nelson's greatness included the danger that it might have been catastrophe. History forgave him because he won. It is not always wise to let outcomes decide ethics, but nations often do. His legacy, therefore, is double, as most human legacies are. He helped secure Britain against invasion and made possible the long economic and imperial expansion of the 19th century. Trafalgar did not end the wars. Napoleon would still dominate Europe until Waterloo, but it ended in practice any serious challenge to Britain's maritime supremacy during that era. The sea became Britain's strategic certainty, and that certainty shaped the modern world: trade, colonies, industrial growth, and the political confidence of an island that felt protected by water and wood and men like Nelson. At the same time, Nelson's story reminds us how a nation turns a man into a symbol and then forgets the man. After his death, Emma Hamilton, so central to his private life, so inseparable from his late years, fell into debt and disgrace, and the state did not fully honor Nelson's wish that she be cared for. The public can afford to be moral after it has taken what it wants from a hero. Even in this, there is a kind of historical irony. Nelson, who mastered the impersonal forces of war and weather, could not master the impersonal indifference of institutions. If one seeks the meaning of his life beyond battles, it may lie in the spectacle of will. Here was a man often sick, repeatedly wounded, chronically in pain, and emotionally tumultuous, yet capable of sustained concentration and repeated courage. He did not conquer his nature. He harnessed it. The same intensity that made him crave affection made him crave victory. The same need to be admired made him reckless with his own safety. The same certainty that made him decisive could make him blind to political nuance. He was not a balanced man. But history is not built only by balanced men. It is often built by those whose inner storms match the outer ones, and who, for a few years, impose their personal rhythm upon the larger world. When Trafalgar's smoke cleared, Europe remained a continent of armies. Britain remained an island of ships. Nelson's life, spent in the narrow corridor between those two facts, became the story a maritime nation tells itself about courage, duty, and the price of command. In that story he stands, not as perfection, but as a concentrated human energy, brief, flawed, incandescent, burning fast enough to light an age.